Hi, this is Bob from Insidium. In this video, we'll look at recreating this cool procedural sand disintegration scene. We're going to be using nxFluids to get this really nice granular sim, and other Nexus tools, modifiers, data mapping, and nxQuestion to control how this procedurally crumbles, cracks, and then gets blown away. It's a really nice sim, looks fantastic, loads to do, so let's jump into cinema and we'll begin. Here's our starting scene then, and we've got a ground plane and we've got this bust, which is just from the Cinema 4D content browser. And we've got an empty X-Particles system here. Just a note before we get going, the bust, if we come down to our coordinates manager, you can see we've actually scaled this up from the default size, and it is now, if you look at the Y, it's just under 113 centimeters tall, and that's actually significant because obviously scaling it up changes the volume of the object, which means it changes how many particles are able to fit inside, so it dictates the particle emission. So let's go and get those particles in here. If we go to the emitters folder, we can go create emitter. Here's our new emitter, and in the object tab we're going to go to the emitter shape and change it to object. We're going to drag in our bust, and that's where we want to emit from. And the emission mode, we want to use a shot emission, so shooting out on one frame, and we want to change the shot type to our special granular mode, which is hexagonal. And let's just turn our speed of our particles off. We want 0 speed. And hexagonal emission mode, it looks at the particle radius and it packs as many particles as is possible of that size within the volume of our bust in an hexagonal grid. So let's just, as a working amount, let's just put 1 centimeter. We'll actually go much lower than this for more particles later, but now as we're working just for draft, we'll do 1. Let's go forward a frame, make the bust invisible, and there we have got our particle cloud. All right, now the first thing we want to do is set up some color animation, which is going to drive all of our effects later. So first of all, we want our particles to be born black, and we're going to animate them to white. So let's go to our emitter, display tab, and we're going to change our particle color, this birth color of the default blue, to black. And then we'll go forward a frame. Yep, now we've got our black particles. So our animation is going to happen with a Nexus modifier. Let's go to the Nexus options, and we're going to bring in an NX color to animate the color of our particles. And what we want, we need to add a layer. The layer we want to add is a gradient parameter layer. So let's add this gradient parameter here. And we want to do black and white values actually, and the gradient by default is blue to white, which is a good one for fluids. So let's just get rid of these knots, and in this blue one, let's just change that and remove all that value so it goes black to white. Now by default, it's going to map this gradient to the parameter default is set to age. So if we hit play, particles start black and they gradually get lighter as they get older. So that is that. Not what we want. We want to use a bit of a nice kind of textured noise pattern for these. So to do that, in our NX color, we're going to select a field as the parameter to map to. So now we need to define the field itself. There aren't any fields in our scene at the moment. So let's go to the fields tab of our color modifier, and it will use this field stack to map those black and white values to. So the first one, let's bring in a random field, and if we just hit play on the defaults, it is going to map it to the defaults of the random, and we can see it happening there. Look, a nice noise pattern, and this is set to Perlin noise with 100% scale. Let's change the noise type to one a bit more interesting, Luca. We'll put the scale way up to maybe 1000. Now spawn those particles. Yeah, now we've got this quite interesting noise effect. We could do with a bit more contrast in this. Now we don't have clipping options in this field, so we have to do it in the remapping. So let's go to the remapping options, come down to the bottom of the interface, change the contour mode to curve, come down again, and now we've got this curve that we can add contrast to. Let's just crush the blacks up to maybe 0.2-ish, and the whites to 0.8-ish, something like that. And now we should have a much higher contrast noise. Yeah, look, that's looking cool, isn't it? All right, so that is one of our fields, but we're going to add a bit of animation here by layering up some fields. So the next one, we're going to add a linear field. There we go. And in the linear field, we're going to set this to multiply blend mode, which I'll explain in a minute. So the linear field, let's go to the field options. We want to change this to +y, so it's up and down. And the length at the moment, that's a little bit, it's a bit too big. Let's put this on maybe 20.5, something like that. Yep, cool. So now that we've got this on multiply, anywhere where the field has a value of 0, it is black. And as that goes to 1, it then reveals the noise texture. And if we move this, look, you can see it animating. So that's pretty cool. Let's put it up here. So what we want to do is kind of angle this a little bit. So let's go to the linear field settings, to the coordinates. And with the pitch, let's put the pitch at maybe, I don't know, let's try 33. Yeah, but we want it to be angled in a different way. So let's change this heading through to maybe, I don't know, let's try maybe not full 90, 85 degrees, something like that. Very good. And then if we move that up and down, so we're going to bring this down to reveal these white particles, which will start the crumbling effect. Cool. So we could actually keyframe this. Let's just switch off the emitter for now. So on frame 0 with our linear field in the Y, let's put that at, I don't know, maybe 85. Yeah, that looks good. Hit a keyframe. Then we're going to go through to frame, I don't know, 40, 39. And on this one, we'll reduce this Y down to maybe, I don't know, that looks pretty good. Let's put -2.5. That looks good. Hit a keyframe. Right, so then reactivate our emitter, hit play, and we have got our particle color animating. Fantastic. Right, so how are we going to use this color to drive our movement of our particles? We are going to use this color to change the particles into different groups, which gives us loads of control. So let's get that set up. The way we're going to do it is, if we go to NeXus, let's go to the Object tab. We want to bring in a nxQuestion, and we're going to ask a question of the particle color. So let's add a question layer, and in this we're going to say if the particle, not the age, if the particle color, and we need to say that the vector chooses which color. Is it the red, the green, the blue, or the overall brightness? We want the brightness because we're dealing with black and white values here. So we'll click brightness. If the particle color brightness is greater than 0.5, then do something. Okay, and the something we want to do, let's add an action. We don't want to set the color to yellow. We want to set the group to a new group. Now, we haven't got any groups in the scene yet, so we can't actually set it. So let's get this new group set up. We'll go to the groups folder here. We'll create a new group, just called particle group 1, that's fine. So now we can go back to our nxQuestion, to this action, set group 2. Let's drag it in here. So if a particle has a color brightness of over 0.5, then it gets put into group 1. Perfect. So if we hit play, nothing looks any different, but under the hood, all of these particles that have a color brightness of over 0.5 are now in group 1. Let's just put this question below the NX color. So it does the color animation first, then it asks the question of the color. It makes sense to be in that order. Now, the reason we have done this will become clear when we bring in our first modifier, which will change the movement of our particles. So let's do that. Let's go to our NeXus options, and we're going to bring in a NeXus wind. This is what we're going to use to move our particles away from their start position. So in our wind, let's go to the coordinates tab. And what we could do is change our heading. Look, you can see our wind fan here, and this is going to be blowing them in this direction. So that's what we want. So in that heading, let's put this on maybe -95, something like that. And then we want to kind of blow them upwards a bit. So let's put this pitch on maybe, I don't know, 55, looks pretty good. Okay, so if I hit play now, all of our particles are being affected by this wind, and they're all just going to get blown upwards. And actually, there's one other thing you can see here. Look, you can see as they're blowing up, they are being changed dependent on their position within that random field, and their colour isn't fixed, is it? And actually, that isn't quite what we want. So we can make a quick change to our colour modifier, and with our gradient by parameter layer, by default it's set to normal blend mode, so it'll just change it every frame. It doesn't matter where it is, wherever it is positioned within the field, it will change it from black to white. However, because they're all born black, if we change this to additive mode rather than normal, it just means that they'll blend to white, but then they won't go back to black because it's in add mode, so it can't remove that colour. All right, so now we only want these particles to be blown away by the particles that have been put into group 1. And that's really easy. We just go to our wind modifier, go to the groups affected, drag in particle group 1, and now the wind won't affect the black particles. It'll only affect the particles when they're put into group 1. Brilliant. So that is the basis of our simulation. That is how we're going to get this to work. We get our particles, they get put into group 1, and group 1 is affected by the wind, and everything else we work from this basic principle and from this point. So what we're going to do is refine our colour animation just a little bit. If we just switch off that wind for now and we hit play, you see that we've got our nice colour animation, but we have lots of patches of dark that obviously aren't going to get affected by the wind. And what we're going to do, instead of animating our noise within our fields to get our entire object to become white, we're actually going to use another modifier to take it kind of from this point and to get a gradual creep of black to white until everything is put into group 1 eventually. And we'll do that. Let's go to the NeXus options. We're going to do that with an NX blend modifier. On the blend modifier, we go to the object tab. We're going to do a couple of things. We're going to set the blend mode to addition, and we're going to blend just the colour. And what that is going to do is each particle is going to look within 10 centimeters of itself, and it's going to blend its colour with those surrounding particles. But because it's set to add mode, it'll only get lighter. This is going to be a bit too much. Let's put this down to say 5, and we'll hit play, and we're probably not going to see a huge amount of blending going on here. Let's have a look, and we're getting a very, very perhaps slight blend going on. What we need to do is massively increase our strength. So let's put this strength way up to say 1000, and let's hit play. Yeah, look, so that's hugely increased, hasn't it? And then it gets to this point and every single one is now white. So we could slow that down a little should we wish, but now we've got this nice initial white, and then it all bleeds down until everything is white. And this is going to be the basic animation. Let's just reactivate that wind, press play, and we'll see this coming into action. Then we've got our black particles turn white, they're getting moved by the wind. Excellent. So that is our kind of basic dissolve setup. Let's just look at some of our wind settings, because at the moment this isn't looking particularly interesting. So by default, the NX wind is in the standard wind mode, but we're going to change this from standard to von Karman. Von Karman is brilliant because it simulates these kind of realistic gusts of turbulent air, which is fantastic. So what we need to do is make some adjustments. If we hit play, you may see a slight bit of difference, bit of turbulence in there. So it's looking different already. And that's because we have these default turbulence settings on in the von Karman mode. We're going to do a couple of things here. We're going to hugely increase the strength of this. Let's put this wind strength on, I don't know, pretty high, 625, and we'll just leave it on 625, and you'll see that we'll get a little bit of kind of stepping, and they're all flying off because they're all flying off exactly the same speed. So what we're going to do is add a bit of variation here, and there's a cool trick we can do with this variation. If we put the variation on 50%, then we're going to get some variation in that wind strength, and we get something that looks a little bit smoother and more random. But here's a cool thing. If we go above 100%, let's put this on maybe 190, we'll get some kind of reverse wind going on. So it goes in the other direction. Let's have a look. Start playing. And like you look, these are going in the other direction because they have over 100% of variation. So they have some wind strength that is a minus value, which is giving us this kind of blowback. Now, at the moment, it doesn't look particularly great because we don't have our physics solver binding these particles together yet. But this is going to look really cool when we start introducing the grains. One thing we could do is that these particles are not interacting with our ground, they're just flying through it, and we can sort that out. Let's go to the ground plane and go to tags, extensions, Insidium tags, and put on an XP collider. We'll take off the bounce and maybe put 3 friction on. And now when we hit play, we're going to get those particles, and they're going to come down and they're going to bounce off this when they hit it. Yeah, look. So that's much better. That's going to look more realistic. Very cool. Let's go to our wind options and just have a look at this turbulence, because we can make some adjustments here. I don't think we need our frequency to be quite so high, so that turbulent noise isn't animating through its cycle so quickly. Let's maybe put that frequency down to, I don't know, 40. And if we increase this friction velocity, you're going to see a kind of a greater effect of this noise. And again, at this strength, without our grains physics, it might not be immediately obvious. But let's just up this. Small increments will make a big difference. Let's put this on 0.13. So a small increment, and the turbulent swirls will be a bit more pronounced. Again, it'll be much more obvious. Yeah, that's looking good. It'll be much more obvious when we get our physics in the scene. All right, so that's looking pretty good. We've got our wind sorted for now. We might make some tweaks once we add the grains. We've got our color animation from the color and the blend modifiers. Everything is ready to go. So now we're able to start thinking about making this into a realistic grains render. So we'll sort the fluids out now. So let's go to NeXus, and we're going to bring in an nxFluids. Here it is, and we're in SPH mode by default, which is correct, but we want to change the fluid type to granular. Now, for accurate grains with that nice kind of sandy clumping, you have to have very high accuracy in the velocity solve, and that is accomplished by having high substeps. So we'll just try it at maybe 12 for this sim, and then we'll come down to our granular settings. We're going to whack our friction up, and let's just leave everything else on default and hit play. And now we're going to get a granular sim. So let's have a look. And oh, look at that, the whole thing is being lifted up, and that is because by default our stability is too high for these particles to be able to break apart. So how do we sort that out? Well, let's just decrease this stability way down to say 5. And this means that the particles will be able to free themselves from the friction holding them together. Look, yeah, and look, it's tearing off into clumps. Excellent. So that's looking pretty good just on those settings. We've got one issue here though, that look, remember, we don't want our black particles to be moved by the wind. But if we look at this, you can see that our black particles, look, do start to move. These are lifting off the floor. Why is that happening? Well, it is because our particles, now we've got this granular solve going on, these particles have friction and they're sticking and clumping together. So even though the black particles aren't being affected by the wind, because the white ones are, the black ones are getting dragged along as well. And we need to stop that. So what we're going to do is we're going to put in an extra kind of speed control for our black particles. And this is how we're going to do it. We're going to go to nxQuestion, and let's bring in another question. We're going to do it with a separate question, and it's really important. This question has to be last in our stack because we want everything else to be calculated, all of the movement, but then right at the end we want to say, if you're a black particle, you're not allowed to move. Let's just rename this and call this one speed. Oh, I've got caps lock on there. Speed clamp. There we go. And in this question, we'll go to the object tab. We're going to add a question, and we're going to say, well, look, we have only got one group here, aren't they? When the particles are white, they go into group 1. So we basically want to say, if you are not in group 1, then have your speed clamped to 0. How do we ask that within question? Well, we just go, if the particle group, and then look, let's just say, if the particle group is less than 1, then do this thing. Now, the white particles are in group 1, and any other particle, if it's not in its own group, it's just considered to be in group 0. It's given a group number of 0, and because 0 is less than 1, this is going to work. If the particle group number is less than 1, then do something. That's what we want. So let's just put in the action, and we don't want to set the color. We want to set the speed to 0. Okay, so if that has worked, we should have our perfectly static black particles, and that means that the white ones will just break away. Yeah, look, they're remaining stuck right until the very end. That's working perfectly. So we've basically got, at low particle resolution, our crumbling simulation here. This is looking good. There's one thing we can do. We're going to make a couple of adjustments to our grains, actually, because there's part of this look that we haven't got right just yet. But before we do, if I just come out of our Redshift camera here, and let's just dolly out a bit, get above this plane, you can see that all of those particles that are out of the view, they are all still being calculated. And this is really inefficient because in our scene we have got a static camera. There's no need to be calculating all of these grains out of shot. And when you are doing high particle count sims with millions of particles, it'll massively reduce your cache and render times if we can reduce the amount of particles that we're actually calculating. So we've got a really cool trick here where we can get rid of this. So if you've got a static camera, this is perfect for you. We'll go to nxQuestion. Let's go and bring in an nxKill. And in this nxKill, we're going to set it to outside the camera field of view, and then we can drag in our scene camera that we're going to be rendering with into that camera. And now let's come out of this camera and we'll just play, and you'll see that we get our particles. They'll start blowing in the wind, but then as soon as they're out of that camera's field of view, they'll be killed off. Yeah, look, they're being killed off by that camera. And if we go to this side and hit that so we can see that camera's field of view, you'll see, yeah, look, perfect. So when they go out of the field of view, they're being killed off. So if we go in the camera, it means that nothing changes in our frame, but we've just got a way more efficient scene, and we'll be caching far fewer particles when we do the whole scene. Very good. What you can do is you can widen, if we go to our nxKill, you can widen the field of view by however many degrees to make sure that you don't get any that kind of get clipped before. But for us, this is going to work fine as is. And now we have a much more efficient scene. And the more we come along, the fewer particles are being calculated because they're being killed off when they go outside of that view. Excellent. Right, one last thing we want to sort out before we start refining this and making it much higher particle count is, if we play it through, you'll see that we're getting our nice chunks breaking off, but they remain, watch this one, it remains a chunk and just falls away as a big chunk. It splits into two, but then it goes away as these big chunks. And actually, we want this chunkiness as it first disintegrates and dissolves, but then we want them to break apart and almost become like dry sand. So how might we do that? Well, all we need to do is go to our nxFluids, and if I put my friction on 1, my stability on 1, my cohesion on 1, and hit play, we're going to have just much more like free sand that's just able to float off on its own. So what we want to do is we want to go from them having those higher levels of friction, which started at 100% friction. What did we have? 5% stability, and reset to default. What was that on? We had 10% cohesion. We want to start with these values, but then as they float off, we want them to reduce, so these break up into kind of individual grains. Now, we're going to do this we could do it with keyframing, but that's a bit of a kind of a blunt-edged tool, really. What we want to do it is with data mapping. We're going to map these values. So let's go to our mapping tab, and we're going to bring in we're going to do this actually over distance. How far have these particles traveled? So let's bring in a distance map. And the first one, let's do it to, let's go back to our fluids. We'll do it to this, we'll map the friction value here. So let's go back to our mapping. So the category is SPH and the parameter is friction. We want to do it over distance, and we want to say when the particles have traveled quite a short distance, we want the clumping just as they break off, and then we want to reduce these settings. So let's say that we want this to start when they've traveled 5 centimeters. So 5 centimeters is the minimum, and then over the next 95 centimeters up to 100 centimeters, we want their friction to tail off. So this is working. What this is saying is this range min to max, 5 centimeters to 100 centimeters, is mapped over the x-axis of this spline here. So this is when they've traveled 5 centimeters up to 100 centimeters. And then this y-axis is our parameter. So we want them to have full friction when they're born up to 5 centimeters, and then over the next 95 centimeters, the friction gets less and less and less and less until there's no friction at all. Brilliant. So that's just friction, and this on its own, let's have a look and see if it's enough. My guess is we're going to have to reduce the stability and the cohesion to get this effect to work proper. So yeah, look, we've got more breakup, but we've still got the stability and those cohesion settings trying to keep them together. So let's do the same thing, but with the other parameters. We've done friction. Let's make a duplicate of this, and in the duplicate we'll change it to stability, and we'll just leave it exactly the same. And then let's make another map, and this one will do the cohesion, and let's keep that cohesion together a bit longer, but still have it fall off over that time. So now we've got this. We should have the clumps as they first move. So we want the clumps breaking off, and yes, look, now they're disintegrating. That's looking really good. Excellent. So I think that is going to do us for our mapping and for our kill. All right, so now we have got that sorted out. What we need to start doing is exploring how we can do this at much higher particle counts. So what we'll do is we'll start adjusting the particle count, but there's also some very important settings that we need to sort out to make sure that this looks good in the render. So actually, let's just do that. Let's start rendering a scene here so we can actually see what this looks like with the current particle count that we have here. So in our emitter emission tab, we've got our radius set to 1 centimeter in hexagonal mode. So that's giving us, if we go to our display, HUD, show HUD, that's giving us only 62,000 particles, which is a tiny number for a grains sim. When we do this at full resolution, we'll be looking at more like 6 million particles. So let's just have a look at what this would look like in our render. So if we go to our emitter tags, we'll go to render tags and add a Redshift object tag. In this object tag, we'll go to the particles and set it to sphere instances. And then we'll go to Redshift, render view, hit render. Oh, actually, look, we're rendering our bust here. So let's just make that invisible. There are our particles. They're all black at the moment. So actually, let's give them a material instead. We'll go to our material manager, double click. We've got a default Redshift material here that we'll put on the emitter. And let's just go into that default material and we'll make them rough. And then let's just give them a bit of color, something, I don't know, something a little like that maybe. Okay, and let's come out of there. Right, so if we just increase that a little, you can see that at this particle resolution, it obviously looks almost like Minecraft, doesn't it? I mean, we're not getting enough detail here in our sim, and we're going to get a nice kind of look to the simulation because the physics are working nicely. We've got the clumps coming off, but you can obviously see these gridded particles. So this is just way too low resolution. Let's just move it on a few frames so we get to a bit where we've got a nice full frame of our kind of dissolving particles, something like that. Hit render, and yeah, so clearly it is not looking good, and it's just a matter of not having enough particles in the scene. So what we're going to do is start increasing our particles, and we're going to do that, but we also want to get rid of this very regular grid look that we get from the hexagonal emission. So we're going to sort that out. Just before we do, I've just noticed that I think we've got a really strong wind here with this nice variation, which is kicking it up and really kind of blowing them up here around where they start fragmenting. But they get a little bit wild as they're getting towards the outside of our frame. So what I'm going to do before, this is going to be the last simulation kind of tweak really, what we're going to do is just ensure, we're going to keep the wind as strong as it is because I really like the way it's moving, but we're just going to clamp the maximum speed of the particles just so they can't move too quickly. And the way we'll do that, this is really quick and simple. We're going to get a nxus and we're going to get an nx speed modifier. I'm going to put this one after our wind, and in this nx speed we're going to go to our object tab. I'm going to set this operation to acceleration, but we're going to put the exponential onto 0, so there's no acceleration going on. If we hit play, there is absolutely no difference here. This modifier isn't doing anything at all. But what we're able to do now is activate this clamp max speed option, and I'm just going to clamp it. Look at that default, we're going to clamp the maximum speed at 500 centimeters. So we're still getting all of the variation from the wind and that nice turbulent movement that hasn't been lost, but none of the particles are allowed to go over 500 centimeters in speed, and it just means it's not going to be quite as wild towards the kind of the edges of this simulation. Excellent. So now we've got that sorted, we can forget about the sim settings for now, and we can start concentrating on getting a much higher particle count into our sim. So what we're going to do that is we're going to, let's switch off all of these modifiers, and we're going to go to our emitter, emission tab, and we are going to reduce the radius, so smaller particles, more will be able to fit in the volume within this hexagonal grid, so we need to reduce the radius. And I'd urge you, if you're doing your own scenes with different geometry, reduce these in small increments, because the particle count will rise exponentially when you go down in radius size, so it can get out of control pretty quick. So I know from experimentation that 0.225 in the radius for this model size in this scene is going to give us just over 5.5 million particles, and that count for this scene at this camera position is going to be more than adequate. So 0.225. So now that we've got that, let's just go forward one frame. Now this is going to take an awful lot longer to initialize these birth particles, because obviously there's just way more, 5.5 million. The first frame always takes longer than the subsequent frames will then take to simulate. But it's just something when you're working with grains at kind of production levels, you just have to get used to the fact that things slow down, even on the GPU. There are so many millions of calculations taking place. So here are our particles. Let's do a quick render to see what they look like. So this is the first render we did, 60,000 odd particles. Let's render now, and this is going to calculate the render for 5.5 million. And obviously, look, you'll notice that Redshift is obviously slower as well, because it's got to load in those millions of particles. It's got to instance spheres in their position. But there we go. So that's looking really nice now, isn't it? The only part really you can see the problem is here. Look, you can really see the regular grid in these kind of stepped parts on his forehead, so that's not going to work. And there's also some quite obvious horizontal lines on the base here, so we need to sort that out. The way we're going to sort that out is with a technique that we've done in other grains videos, and there's also a top tip for this. We're going to jitter the position of these particles. Now, before we do this jittering, what I'm going to do is make sure, and this is important, I want this ground plane collider tag to be inactive. So look, we can switch it off by disabling the collisions, because we're going to jitter our particles, which is going to slightly move them. And I don't want them moving into the plane, which will bounce them back up on themselves. That's going to cause issues. So we've switched off this collision tag whilst we do this jittering operation. We're going to go to the emitter, emission tab, and we're going to add some jitter in the X and Y and the Z. And this, as I said, it just jitters the position randomly for each particle to kind of disrupt the regular hexagonal grid. It's a good idea to not go above your particle radius. Let's just put in the particle radius as well. We'll jitter it by 0.225, 0.225. All right, that's looking good. So the only problem with this is that if we jitter this, it's going to break up the grid. But because it's randomly jittering the particles in all different directions, it means that some particles, many particles, will be intersecting with other particles. And we don't want that. That is going to cause the sim to be unstable. If fluid particles are born in an intersected state, it causes a big pressure and they'll blast away. And it's not going to work for us. So we want this jitter, but we need to separate out the particles again. So the way we're going to do that is with another modifier. Let's go to NeXus. We're going to bring in an nxPush modifier. We're going to set it to particle radius, full strength. Now, with the iterations, with 5.5 million particles, we're going to need thousands of iterations if we want this to have been performed in one frame. So let's try maybe 4,000 iterations. So in one frame, it's going to iterate this push 4,000 times, and that should be enough for every particle to have kind of separated out and relieve itself of any of those intersections. So with it set like this, what we're going to do is go back to the first frame, go forward one frame. Now this is going to take a long time because we're going to have to first birth the particles, and then this push has got to do 4,000 times working out how to push apart 5.5 million particles. So this is probably going to take 2 to 3 minutes just to do this first frame, but we only need to do it once in our sim, and then we can then move on and not do the push calculation again. So it's a kind of a one-time deal. So I'll pause this now and I'll come back to you when it's done. Okay, and that took 3 minutes to get our push to work. So now that we've done that, we have jittered our particles and we have pushed them apart, so we won't have those intersections, so we'll be able to safely run our fluid sim. Now there's one last issue that we'll have to address before we could move on from this stage. Let's hit F5 to go to our orthographic views, and we want to go to this front view here. Let's make this max. So I'm not sure if you can see, but this black line here is our ground plane, and you can see that actually, look, we have particles intersecting the ground plane. Now they weren't intersecting it before, but they have been, some of them have been pushed down within that jitter operation, because they're obviously intersecting, they push each other apart, and some of them have pushed downwards. That's why we deactivated our collision tag here, our collider tag, because we didn't want them pushing down, them being bounced back up by the collider. But this is an issue. We need to get rid of these particles that have been pushed below. Now, the easiest way to fix this is that we're just going to kill them. So let's hit F1 again to go to our perspective view, and we are going to bring in a nexus. Let's bring in a kill modifier. Where are you? Kill. There we go. Now, this kill modifier, we are going to set this. Let's put this size down to, I don't know, say 100. And what we want is we want this. We have this box. We're within the bounds, and we're going to say that we want particles to be killed if they go inside this bounds. And what we want is we want the top of the box to be lying flat at the same level as our plane. So let's just have a look at the plane. Go to the coordinates. You'll see that it's not actually at world 0. Look, it's at -50. So if we just go to our nxKill modifier here, the new one, go to coordinates, and it's 100. So let's put -100 in the y. And yes, look, so that we can see the top of our kill modifier box is exactly where our plane is. That means that any particles that go below the plane inside the kill will be killed. And again, we only need to do this on one frame. So the last thing, before we do this, you must have the kill must come after the push in the order of operations. So in that first frame, it'll push. It'll do that 1,000 iterations of the push modifier. It'll push some of the particles through the floor, and then they'll be killed by the kill modifier. So it has to be this way around. So let's go back, and we'll go forward frame again. Now again, this is going to take 3 minutes because it's got those 1,000 push iterations to go through. So I'll pause it and come back to you when it's done. Okay, and that has been done. Let's go to F5. Go to our front view again, and look, you can see, yes, we have now killed those particles that have gone below. So there are none below our plane. Brilliant. So now we're finished with this. We can switch off this push. We can switch off the kill. And now we can save this state of particles as the birth state. So they'll just appear on the first frame like this without any need to do the push and the kill. And the way we do that is go to the emitter, emission. We go to the object tab, initial state. And I can set state, and it'll save all of these particles and all of their data in this state, and it'll load it from this state on the first frame. Because of that, we need to go to the emission tab. We don't need to shoot more particles. We're done. We're just going to load from that state. So we can put the emission type to controlled only, so it won't emit any more particles. It'll just load them in from that state. Fantastic. Right, so I think we're ready to do a cache now. Now this cache, let's activate all of our modifiers apart from the push and the kill that we don't need anymore. Let's activate all of these, and we are going to do a cache. Now there are going to be some issues with this. This isn't going to be the perfect simulation straight off the bat, but we need to just cache it out at this particle resolution to get an idea of how it's working and how it's looking, and then we can make tweaks from there. So we're going to go to our utilities folder. We're going to bring in an XP cache. Oh, and just before I do not forget to do this. This is fundamental. We must remember to reactivate our collisions. Otherwise, we'll do our long cache and then be weeping at our keyboards when we realize that we have forgotten to activate it. So enable your collisions. We want that back on so those collisions are working. Then let's go to our XP cache. I'm just saving it to my documents. When we're doing granular sims with millions of particles, the cache will be very big. So it's a good idea to have compress cache on build activated. So I'm going to go back to the first frame, and then we'll build cache. Now, this is going to load those particles in from the initial state, and then it will start beginning to simulate it with all of our modifiers and our questions. And what it's going to do, I'm just going to stay with you for a minute, because what it's going to do is going to estimate how long it thinks it's going to take to cache these 500 frames. But actually the estimate is going to be, it's going to be an overestimate, because if you remember, the vast majority of our particles will be dead by around frame 200, because they'll have gone out of the frame, and so from then on it'll be very quick to simulate. So our first estimate from the first frame was 3 hours. Now it's starting to kind of simulate proper. Now it's calculated the second frame and it's gone down to 1 hour and 48 minutes. That's the rough estimate, but it's going to be way less than this, because as I said, most of the particles are going to be dead by around frame 200. So we'll pause it there. I'll come back to you when this is finished. We'll see how long it took, and we'll have a look at this first sim and see what tweaks we need to make. And that cache is now done, and it was actually really quick. Let's go to the cache. It only took just over 20 minutes to cache that. So really good performance. Now we have got lots of particles in our scene, and even though this is all cached, the viewport performance is having to draw all of these particles every time. So one way we can speed things up is a couple of things. If we go to our emitter display tab and we select the dots editor display mode, these are quicker to draw, and if we force display, even though it's cached, it'll draw dots instead. So these are lighter to draw in the viewport, but also what we can do is reduce the level of detail. We don't need to see all 5.5 million particles. It's a waste of processing power drawing all those. Let's put this down to just 1%, and actually now it's on 1%. Look, we could probably just do the squares. Yeah, something like that. Okay, and this will update a lot more quickly. So here is our scene, and if we just come forward a bit, you can see, look, we're getting our animated particles animating their way. It's all looking pretty cool, but you don't get much of an idea until you do a render. So let's go to one of the parts where the particles are first starting to kind of fly up, something like that, and we'll go to Redshift, render view, and let's render that, and we're going to have some really nice sandy looking crumbling animation going on here. So here we go. Yeah, look at that, looks absolutely fantastic. So one of the issues here, and this is going to be one of the things, one of the fixes that we're going to do, because we will be caching again, is we're getting, this looks really nice, this crumbling, but it's breaking apart a little too easily, and I'd like some bigger clumps here before it then disintegrates off into nothing. So what we need to do to get some bigger clumps is, let's just switch that off, we need to go to our nxFluids, go down to our granular settings, and we need, now we've got loads more tiny particles, we need to increase the stability, which is going to give us bigger clumps. So I am going to put this up on, say, 15, and I think that's going to be a good amount. Now you just learn through experience how to make tweaks to these, and it can be a bit frustrating working with grains, because you have to make a tweak, then you have to cache it, then you have to do, sometimes you have to do, you can't really obviously play it in real time in the viewports, then you have to do a test render to then see whether those tweaks are correct, and you have to be in it for the long game. Really, it is a time consuming process. It can be frustrating, but the results can be amazing when you finally crack it. And the more you do it, the more kind of you can intuitively know how much you need to change these settings by. So let's go with a stability of 15. Now there's another couple of tweaks that we're going to make. You'll notice that when we come towards the end of our sim, we're getting these kind of stragglers that carry on floating around. And now remember, we are only looking at 1% of the particles here. So from the main wisp of the sand disappears around there, look, at about frame 187, and then we get these stragglers. And the reason we get these stragglers kind of wisping around the place is because our wind, remember we put a variation of over 100%. So that means that this wind is gusting in the direction it's pointing, but then when it goes over 100% variation, it then goes back the way it came. And so with some of the particles, a minority, they're going and then they're coming back and they're never leaving the frame, and we want it to leave the frame. So what we could do at about here, when that last kind of cloud disappears, from this point on, look, let's put a keyframe on our variation, then move forward a few frames, and then put that variation down to definitely something under 100%, so you can't have negative wind, something like that. And that means that then they'll, between these keyframes, they'll then just all start blowing in this direction and they'll leave the frame and then they will die. And I think that's all we need, really. Let's go to a point, we haven't rendered anything where we've got a bit of a cloud of particles. Let's go to this frame, go to the Redshift render view, hit render. Now thinking, partly thinking our material is perhaps slightly too dark here, and we haven't really done a proper sand material, we've just done a very basic one, but it's perhaps a little bit too dark for our render. But this is looking really nice, isn't it? This looks excellent. Let's just do a couple of things. We could go to our material manager. Let's put a material on our floor that has a little bit of reflection. So we'll double click on here. This is just a default Redshift material. Let's put this on our ground, and because that has got reflections in by default, we're going to get some nice kind of grey reflections here. Yeah, look, that's looking pretty cool, isn't it? I think we could probably perhaps take some of those out though, actually, because those heavier shadows did look quite nice, didn't they? Let's go into our material manager here, go to our standard material, and what we could do is just reduce the weight of those reflections a little, which brings some of that shadowing back in, maybe something like that. And then we could perhaps lighten this a little, maybe slightly darker. Anyway, we can faff around with that. It's not really a tutorial for ground plane materials, but something like that's looking pretty nice. We've got a bit of reflection going on there and now as well. And then let's go to our sand material and let's just lighten this up a little bit. Yeah, I prefer it maybe like that, a little bit more colour. Yeah, that looks all right. Okay. So this is looking really quite cool, but we need to resim because we have made changes to that stability option. Let's just let this last frame render and have a look at that. But this breaking up is looking really nice. I'm very pleased with this overall look. This looks fantastic. When we've got some slightly larger clumps with those changes we've made, this is going to look really cool. All right, so now we have done that, we are ready to cache again. So let's go to our cache object. We're going to build, going to over. Now what you could do if you wanted to, you could incrementally save this as a new scene and bring in a new cache object, so you've got two different versions of the same sim. And when I'm kind of iterating through different looks, that's what I tend to do. I do a separate scene when I make tweaks, bring in a new cache object, recache it, and then I've got various different scenes and caches I can go back to, look at the settings, look at the test renders, and see which one I prefer. But for us, let's just cache over this, that's fine. So we're going to overwrite. And again, this is going to take about 20 minutes, so I'll pause it and come back to you when it's done. Okay, that cache is done. So that again was about 20 minutes. Let's just have a look then. So if we just scrub forward in our timeline, let's get to somewhere. So we were looking at our chunks because we wanted to have slightly larger chunks. Let's see if that adjustment to our stability setting has worked. Let's go to Redshift render view, start rendering, and we should have some nice fatter chunks of sand here which come off the head before they then kind of disintegrate into the powdery goodness. So let's get this initialized on Redshift, and here we go. Yeah, look, this really cool big chunk, and then it's kind of like cracking into smaller chunks there. That's looking really cool. Let's move forward a few frames and see how this is looking, but I'm already really pleased with that. I think that's going to be perfect. Now one thing to bear in mind is, oh yeah, look at that, that is Fantastic, love it. One thing to bear in mind is I was quite keen to have large chunks break off, but then disintegrate into powdery sand very quickly. And as you can see, it's already happening here. And remember, the way in which we did that was, if we just go to our fluid settings, we data mapped the cohesion, the stability and the friction with these distance maps. And it started to have less friction, less cohesion, when it's only moved 5 centimeters. So if you wanted your big chunks to remain around for longer, obviously you could start that minimum range distance at a further distance, like maybe 30 centimeters, and then you can have a big chunk flying through the air for a bit longer before it started to disintegrate. So obviously that's just something to bear in mind, that they are tweaks that can be made. Right, let's just have a look and see whether that animated wind got rid of those stragglers. And yeah, look, they're all just moving away. So we animated that variation, so we stopped getting negative wind, and so then they all just fly off. Yep, cool. And then by the time we get to frame 320 odd, there aren't any particles. Brilliant. Right, let's get a render sorted for this then. Now what we're going to do, this is the cool thing with X-Particles and NeXus. If we have a fixed particle count simulation like this, where all the particles are born on one frame, then we can slow down the playback of this cache to however slow we want, and we will get perfectly smooth slow motion. So I'm going to say that I want to play this back. It's going to be a pretty quick disintegration, this. I want this to be, I'm judging, about half speed. So the way we would do that is this. Let's go to the cache object. We're going to go to the playback. Now, one thing I always do when messing around with the cache is I always ensure that hold is clicked on. And that just means that if we increased our timeline here to say 1,000 frames, and we tried to go to a frame beyond the last cached frame, suddenly NeXus would start trying to calculate those millions of particles again, because it doesn't hold the information in cache, and we don't really want that to happen. If we click on hold, it just means it'll hold the last cached frame for the rest of the timeline. So it's a good thing to click on, and I would usually just put that on by default straight away. So what we need to do to slow down the playback of these grains by half is to put this scale on the playback options onto 50%, and now it's going to be half speed. You could go to 1% and you're still going to get perfectly smooth particle playback, so it's really quite powerful. So now that we've got it on 50%, let's just go through our timeline and work out when we need to stop rendering. So there you can see our particles blowing away. Now you might wonder why they're kind of flickering on and off here. That's just because, remember, in our emitter display tab, we're only looking at 1% of these particles, and because some of the particles are dying off, it kind of changes which ones that we're viewing, but all of those particles are there. Let's just put that level of detail up to 100%, and you can see that they start blowing away. Now at this stage, these particles are so tiny that even when we have this amount of particles in our viewport, if we hit render, my guess is we're not actually going to even be able to see any of those. There'll be no discernible particles. No, you can't really see them. So if you want to, you could render every single one of these frames right till to 600, but it's a bit overkill. I'm going to say rendering up to frame 400 is going to be fine for us. So let's get our render sorted then. We've already kind of got the camera sorted. We have got the sky. We've done those materials. We're just going to render some frames just to see what this looks like. This isn't a full rendering tutorial. So let's go to our render options and go to our render settings. And in our output, I'm just rendering this at low resolution. Look at 720p. Just for speed's sake, and we are rendering from, we don't actually have to render all of these beginning frames. Look, if we go to our viewport, you'll see that we don't actually get our particles until, let's just go to the emitter display options, put that level of detail way down again, just so it's a bit more responsive. So now that we've slowed that cache down a bit, we're not actually even going to get our character particles in the scene until I think frame 3 or maybe frame 4, frame 3 it looks like. But then we're not going to start getting any movement. Let's put this on to say frame 22, we still haven't had any movement here. So we don't need to do those. Let's just say start on frame 10 through to frame 400, and that'll be fine. Right, let's go to our Redshift settings, and let's just make this a little bit bigger. So in our Redshift settings, we'll go to advanced. One thing that I would suggest is going to your system settings, and I have got a pretty powerful graphics card with 24 gig of VRAM. So because of that, I am able to select a very large bucket size. There's enough memory to do that. And if you're able to do that, your renders will render far more quickly. The only danger is if you don't have much memory and you have a large bucket size, you risk using all of that memory and not having enough per bucket. But if you can, stick this on 512 and it'll render a lot more quickly. Then we're going to go to our sampling, and the default here is 0.01. I'm just going to put it up a little bit higher, 0.02. And what this threshold is, it's how much noise is acceptable before more samples are thrown at it. And so a very low threshold number means that it will use more samples, so it will take longer, but you'll have a better quality. And you can play around with this with test renders. You can increase this up to 0.1 and you'll render way more quickly, but there'll be more noise in your scene. I'm going to go with 0.02. That looks cool. And then you've got this random noise pattern. Now this is on by default, and this just means that the noise that's generated per frame will be a different pattern every frame, which is kind of what realistic film noise would do. The only reason you would turn off random noise pattern really is if you're using denoising. And that's because you want that noise pattern to be the same every frame for it then to be denoised. Otherwise, you'll get weird kind of animated smudging in your denoising. We're not using the denoising settings. That means we can have random noise pattern on and we'll get that good kind of realistic film noise that we want. All right, that's looking good. And what I'm going to do, I'm not going to bother saving this one, so I'll uncheck that. But I would always urge you when you're rendering your frames to save them. And that means that if anything goes wrong, if your computer crashes, if there's a power cut, whatever, at least you've got the frames that have already rendered. Just before we hit render, actually, I'm going to go to output and have a look at our frame rate just to make sure that we've got our frame rate correct. It's always good to double check that this is matching your scene frame rate, so that is correct. And if we go to our save options, you can see that we're going to render these as open EXRs, but actually to save a little bit of disk space, we're going to open this up. And look, we're going to have this checked, use 16-bit floats, which means that we'll still have really good quality, most of the data there, but it'll be smaller file sizes. Okay, so now that we have done that, render settings are sorted. What we'll do is hit render to picture viewer, and we'll start rendering. And this is we'll just stick with it actually, and let's see. So the first frame is going to take longer as it kind of loads in all of those particles from the cache at frame 10. It'll render that and then we'll start rendering. So let's just make a little bit of room here so we can see. So the first frame was 16 seconds. My guess is it could be fractionally under that. Let's have a look. Here's the next one. Okay, so about 16 seconds per frame, so that's pretty decent. So what we'll do is I'll leave this rendering, I'll come back to you when it's finished and we'll have a look at the result. Okay, and that render has finished, and let's have a look, and we can see already, look how brilliant these results are. We've got this really nice big crack here, and then those particles disintegrate and turn into much finer sand, and I love how this cracking rips down the side of the bust here, look. And then they lift up and disintegrate. Remember, we've got that kind of negative wind going because of the variation. So we've got some really spitting out this way, sideways. And then they catch the wind and come back in that left to right direction. So that's looking really nice. I'm very, very pleased with that indeed. Because these are EXR files fairly big, you can't fit them all in the cache here to play in real time in the picture viewer. So what I've done, I've actually rendered out an MP4 of this as well. So let's just have a look at that. We'll just switch off that tone mapping. There we go. So this is just a very simple comp in After Effects, and there's no difference here really apart from a bit of pixel motion blur to give a little bit of motion blur to these particles. And once that's cached in, we'll see this in real time. Here we go. And that's looking absolutely fantastic. Really pleased with that. Excellent. So that is how we create this really nice sand dissolve using nxFluids. And obviously we're using the granular mode in nxFluids for this look. Really, really nice look. Relatively simple to set up, and I look forward to seeing what you do with it.